this video, I want to take another look at texturing and show you some different techniques. First of all, let's take a look at a render that I've just completed. And this is similar to a couple of others that I've done in the other videos, but there's a few things different. First of all, you see trees. Now, when it comes to creating a model of a tree, a 3D model, that could be quite difficult. And the reason is because a tree has many different parts. There's the trunk of the tree, there's the individual branches of a tree, and then you have the leaves. Now, there are modelers who will go to the trouble of creating all the geometry that I just mentioned, and you're talking about a project that could take anywhere from hours to days to even months. Now, depending on what you need or what you want to do with your trees, there may be a much simpler approach. The trees that you see in this render are simply one quad or two triangles, and what we have on that triangle, or those two triangles, is simply the picture of a tree. So for each one of the trees that you see in this render, that 3D model only consists of two triangles, which is pretty amazing because the trees look fairly good. Another thing about this render that's a little bit different is you may notice that the ground texture or the grass is a lot better. So before we had one large ground plane with this piece of grass stretched across it, and so the grass, each blade of grass looked pretty gigantic. As you'll see here, the grass looks a little more realistic. It could probably be even better, but it's certainly an improvement over a previous version. So for example, going back to a previous version, we had something like this. So in my opinion, it's definitely an improvement over this previous version. Okay, so in this video I want to talk about primarily the process of creating the 3D models that we see here of the trees, and this is a specific technique known as billboarding, and we're going to use a related technique called alpha blending. And then we'll also look at some tricks on how to improve the quality of your textures, for example, like the grass that you see here. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about this tree model that I have. I've created a model in Lightwave, and I use basically the same technique that I used to create the ground plane. In other words, I started with a box, and I created a box that was the size that I wanted, and then I went ahead and chopped it off, so essentially I had only one side of the box left, which was two triangles. And on those two triangles, or that quad, I mapped a picture of a tree. And let's look at the texture coordinates as well. Now, the model I'm using is this model here. It is a 512 by 512 pixel texture, and it has this picture of a tree on it. Now, you notice this green area surrounding the tree. In the render that I showed you earlier, let's go back and look at that for a minute. You'll notice how in this render here, surrounding these trees, you don't see that big green area or that green rectangle. And so the way we accomplished that is we made that part transparent. So in other words, for each of the trees, the only thing we want to see is the trunk and we want to see the leaves, but the area surrounding it, which is also part of the texture, we don't want to see. We want to make that transparent. So this green area surrounding the tree we want to be transparent. Now, in order to accomplish that, what we need to do is we need to create another image similar to this image, except we need the information in that image that will allow us to encode the transparency. And this technique is what we call alpha blending. And this transparency channel is what we call the alpha channel. So if you look at the other texture I have, you see the alpha channel. Notice in the alpha channel image, the white areas of the texture are the parts that actually show up when we do a render. And the black areas of this alpha image are the areas that are going to be transparent. So it's as simple as that. You just create the image that you want to put onto your 3D model, and then you create a corresponding what we call, sometimes we call it an alpha mask or an alpha channel that encodes in it the transparency information. Now you'll notice in my alpha channel, this is just a grayscale image, and anytime you have the pixels that are completely white, then that means you'll have a completely opaque part to the image. And whenever you have pixels that are completely black, like in this area here, that's going to be completely transparent. Now, if you had something in between black and white, such as a gray value, then you would get what's called partial transparency. Let me show you a few examples of something like that. Okay, here you see some different images that we could use on a 3D model. First of all, take a look at this fireball here at the top. So we see the color of the image, and it's quite interesting. And notice on the right, though, we have the alpha channel for that image. So the areas that are completely black here in the alpha channel will be transparent. The areas that are completely white will be opaque. In other words, they are not transparent at all. And these areas that are grayscale, that are in between white and black, those would be partially transparent. So in some cases, it is desirable to have partial transparency. In the case of this flower, the next image, notice the difference between the color image and the alpha channel. So the alpha channel, similar to the tree I'm using, is just black and white, because there's no part of this flower image that I want to be partially transparent. We either want to see the flowers and the leaves, or we don't want to see this area of the image that doesn't contain those, like this white area. So that's why it's black in the alpha mask. Next we have a model of grass, or a texture for grass. And notice we have the color part of the image and then the alpha part of the image. Here's another one of Saturn, the planet Saturn. And this one actually uses quite a bit of partial transparency. Now that may or may not really be what you want. In fact, if I were going to use this texture on a model, I think I would change this the alpha image so that it doesn't have these gray values. It would either be white or black, because I don't think it would be realistic to be able to see through the planet Saturn to something behind it. And that's what you get with partial transparency. You'll be able to partially see through the model to whatever's behind it. Here's one more model of a tree, and maybe not quite a very interesting tree, but definitely you see the alpha mask is just black and white. So we either want it part of this image transparent or part of it to not be transparent. So those are just a few examples. Now, most of the time when you start off with an image that you want to use in a situation like this, where you want to apply this alpha blending technique, then you'll probably start off with the image like we see here with the fireball. So in other words, that might be the only image you have, and you probably don't have the corresponding alpha mask. Now, I don't think that a program like Microsoft Paint as an image editor is really going to have the tools that we need in order to create the alpha image. You're going to want to step up to another program. I personally use Adobe Photoshop, and I've been using it for years. Now, the only problem with you potentially using that is that's a paid program, and so you would have to purchase it. I do find that places like Academic Superstore are a good place to buy Adobe Photoshop, and you get a discount as a student. Still, if you want to use a program that has the full features like Photoshop, an image editing program, then there is a program that I recommend called GIMP. And here's the website. It's just www.gimp.org. And GIMP is a program, an image editing program that's free to download. And in many ways, it's very similar to Adobe Photoshop. They also have tutorials where you can learn more about how to use the program. And I think that you would find, and here are some of the tutorials, I think that you'll find that you'd be able to do almost anything in GIMP that you can do in Photoshop. Now, I personally don't have a lot of experience with GIMP, so I won't be able to show you in this video how to create an alpha mask using GIMP. That's not something that I've done before, but it certainly should be possible. Now, for purposes of your work this week, I'm not going to require you to create an image with an alpha mask like we have here, but if you want to do that, I would certainly be impressed to see it. And you could either use Photoshop, as I mentioned, or you could try to use GIMP. Download that, look through some of the tutorials, and it'd probably be a good idea to start using that program anyway if this is something that you're going to continue working on in the future, 3D modeling, image editing, and so forth. Another approach is you might be able to find on the internet images with this combination. In other words, the colored image and the corresponding alpha image. And so that's definitely possible. Most of the time you don't have that though, you only have the color image. So I will provide these two images for you so that you can go ahead and get started using these without having to create this image and the alpha image yourself. But let me show you, while we're on this subject, how this is done, for example, in Photoshop. And we will take, let's take this, we'll take a couple of these. I'll start with the image of the flower here. All right, so I've got this open and I'm in Adobe Photoshop right here. All right, so it would almost be better in this particular image if the background was black instead of white, but I think we can get the job done. First of all, I'd probably use the selection tool and I would select the white area of the image. And then I would invert the selection. And that's from the select menu. I'm going to click inverse. So now, instead of having the white area selected, I have the leaves and the flowers selected. And then we can do a cut. And notice how now it's basically cut out everything except the background part. And now we can select everything again and do an inverse. Let's try that one more time. Okay, actually giving me a problem there. Let me save this image first. And that's not a bad idea to save as you're working on something. call this flower mask. Okay, let's go to image this time. I was in the wrong menu. All right, let's go to adjustments, invert. Okay, there we go. Now, first of all, I do have the black background that I wanted, but this other part is not really white. It looks more blue. So I'm going to go to mode and click on grayscale, which will discard the color information. And next, from the image menu, I'm going to click on adjustments, threshold, and I get this dialog here that allows me to set a threshold. So I'll go ahead and move it. Now, I can show you better in a different image how this works, but I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And so now I have a image that's just white and black, and so this would be my alpha mask. So that was one way to create an alpha mask. All right, let's try a different one now. Let's try this fireball. Okay, I like this one a little better because the background part is already black, and that's what I already want in an alpha mask. So I'll just go and click on the image menu at the top, and we'll change this into a grayscale value. And already you can see that it looks like an alpha mask already. So we could actually use this as is, but since there's no areas of the picture that are actually completely white, then this whole thing would have what we call partial transparency. So you would partially be able to see through this. And that might be okay, depending on, what kind of thing you're working on. But let's go again now to the threshold tool. All right, and we have a little bit more interesting use of the threshold tool here. Watch what happens as I move it. Now, I can go all the way out here, which is probably not a good idea, or we can just go out, say, to right about here. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Now what I'm left with is an image that just has a black part and a white part. And so that's something that we could use. You'll get a hard edge around the edge of the fireball, and so you won't have any partial transparency at all, but you definitely don't get any transparency in the middle, which is would probably be desirable. Let me back out of that now. Let's try a different technique. Another thing you can do is just increase the contrast. Something that you can do in almost any image editing program. And watch what happens when I increase contrast and also brightness. So now I have a very white part in the middle, so there would be no partial transparency there. At the edge of the picture we have the black part, which would be transparent, and then in between that we have these gray areas, which would give us some partial transparency. So you'd partially be able to see through that to what's behind it. So I think that would make a very nice alpha mask or alpha image to use. So those are just a few of the techniques in Photoshop. I don't do this very often, so I have to kind of remind myself the process there. But it's not very hard, and you ought to be able to do something similar in GIMP. I don't find, though, that I can do this very easily in Microsoft Paint, so I didn't even bother trying to show that. All right. Well, we've talked about how you might create an alpha mask for an image, but let's go ahead and work with something that we have here. All right, so notice I've got the color picture on the right, I have the alpha mask on the left, and both of these are BMP files. And it's going to be important that they're the same size. So both of these images are 512 pixels in width and in height. So they're square images. So you want them both to be the same size. And on the image on the right, we are using a 24-bit color BMP file. The image on the left, Let's do a properties on that. And you can see this is actually an 8-bit color file. So it would be okay to use a 24-bit color file, but it would be a little bit wasteful in terms of memory, because to store a grayscale value, we really only need 8 bits. We don't need 24 bits. So you have a choice there. You could use 24-bit color, or you could use 8-bit grayscale. But in both cases, I want to have a BMP file. Okay? All right, let's talk about how to create a model for this. So I showed you the model here. And let me just go through the process from scratch. All right, so I'm going to create a new object. I'm going to start with a box, and I'm going to use the front view, which is the bottom left viewport. And you know, as always, when you're creating your initial geometry, you want to probably be watching the numeric tool. And notice the size of this, the height of this is 16 feet. And you know, you may want it to be taller than that. So be sure you're creating something that's, you know, the size that you want. I'm going to hit the space bar now, and in point selection mode, I'm going to delete some of these vertices. Oops. Okay, there we go. And now I'm going to go to polygon selection mode and go over to the right over in the statistics panel, and note that I have some 1 vertex polygons, which I'm going to delete. I have some 2 vertex polygons that I'm going to delete. And what it leaves me with now are just the 2 triangles. All right. Next step is I'm going to create a texture map. And notice we want to take this picture or create this map looking down the Z-axis. Okay, so I'm going to click on New UV Map and set the axis to Z. This is going to be a planar type projection. Okay, so we have our texture map. Now I'm going to go to Surface Editor. All right, now this part is going to be a little different, so you might want to watch carefully. So first of all, let's select the UV projection and set the texture map. And I see you have 2 texture maps here. So the one that I just created recently should be named texture, but let's just double check. Oh, I see in the bottom right of the interface, see that? Where I'm hovering my mouse, it says texture 1. So that's the name of the texture map I created. So I want to be sure and use that. And let's load the image of the tree. And you see it on the model now. Now, that has applied the texture, the color part of the texture. As far as the alpha part, the alpha component, we're going to have to do something a little special. Go back to Surface Editor, and in the middle where it says transparency, let's go ahead and set that to 100%. And to the right of that, you've got a T key, which stands for texture. Let's click on that. And this is going to be an image map, and the blending mode is going to be alpha. The projection is UV, because we're using a UV map to map this onto the model. The name of the UV map, be sure to use the correct name. And then we're going to load the image. In this case, we're going to load the alpha channel image, or the alpha mask. And I'm going to click Use Texture. Now, notice I don't really see that show up in Modeler. So in other words, this dark green part surrounding the tree suddenly did not become transparent. And that's a little limitation in Modeler. It's not going to show the transparency. However, if we render this, we will be able to see it. Okay? If your tree looks a little narrow and maybe you want it larger, that's certainly something that we could correct with the texture map. Notice here's how the texture coordinates are set up. And so I'm going to go into point selection mode, click on total, and I'm going to click on the H key, which does a scaling, and I'm going to click down in the bottom right viewport, the UV texture viewport, and I am going to adjust the texture coordinates here so that I get just the effect that I'm looking for. And notice how it changes how the texture is mapped onto the model. I didn't really want all that extra green, empty space, so we're going to get this a little tighter. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And at that point, you'd want to save your model, and you'll be good to go. All right, now I've already done this and created it, so I'm not going to go ahead and save that one. I'll use the one that I've created previously. And let's go ahead and open that back up again and take a look at it. And I named it tree. Okay, so see, there it is. It's basically the same thing that I was just working on. I'll go back to Surface Editor again and just verify. Now in this case, I actually added the alpha channel here, and that's not really necessary. For some other software that I'm personally using, I need to have the alpha channel in here as well. But in your case, you don't need to have that. In fact, I'm just going to remove that. And now I'm just left with the color image. So we've got the color image. Let's click Use Checker. We've got the color image here set up on color, and we've got the transparency part, or the alpha masks, set up here under transparency. Okay, so those are the two places to set it up. All right, I will go ahead and click Save. Okay. Now let's go into, I'm in my my scene from the last video, and let's go ahead and add a couple of these trees to the scene. All right. So first of all, in the bottom of Layout, I'm going to click on Objects. Now I'm going to go to the File menu. I'm going to click Load Object, and I'm going to get to the right folder, and I'm going to load my tree. Now, this is something I don't like about Layout. Unfortunately, it shows up as you've got like a dotted line. So that's my tree. You can adjust how this renders slightly if you want to look at it a little bit different. For example, click on this area here in the top of Layout, and you have some different ways to show the models that you're working on. And sometimes the texture kind of gets in the way, and sometimes it's nice to work in this view right here where you don't have the texture applied to the model. I'm going to click on, I think it's okay, so I'm going to click on Texture Shaded Solid Wireframe. I'm going to look at it this way. Now, this is where my tree is, and I'm just going to move it over slightly so that it shows up between these houses. And I'm going to click F9 and do a render. And as you can see, we get our tree in the background. Now, an important thing to remember is the camera is essentially facing directly toward the tree. Let's set it up like this where you can see a little bit better. Okay, so we have our camera pointed at that tree. Now, since the tree is really only a quad, 2 triangles, it's going to be important to always make sure that's facing towards the camera. Otherwise, it's not going to look correct. For example, I'm going to click on the Y key, and let's rotate this tree slightly. So let's rotate that over to the left. Now, I want to mention that this technique that we're using is called billboarding. You know what a billboard is? It's just a sign maybe that you see on the road somewhere, and it has a picture on it. But the thing about a billboard, it's flat. So if you're driving by a billboard on the road and you see it, when you get up to the point where you're about to pass it, it's just a flat plane. In other words, let me zoom in. Right, as you're driving along, you may see a billboard and you start to pass it, and at some point it's just a flat plane and you can't see anything. And so that's the same thing here in computer graphics when we use billboards. In fact, let me set it up this way and let's do a render. And notice that we only see the tree, barely, because it's is rotated to the point where we almost don't see it. So for billboards, it's really a great way to put some complex graphics into a 3D scene without creating a lot of geometry. I only have 2 triangles here in this model, but the disadvantage is you have to make sure that you always keep your billboards pointed and facing towards the camera. I'm going to add a couple other trees to this render, and so I'm going to go back to Load Object and click on Tree again. Now, one thing you notice here is the first tree that I put into the scene appears to have gone away, and now I have another tree at the origin. Let's click on Texture, Shaded Solid Wireframe in the top of the interface, and now you see both of them again. So another thing about Lightwave layout that's a little bit strange, things that have a transparency on them can tend to not show up very well. And so you'll want to set the correct rendering mode up here so that you'll be able to see it. Now that I have the second tree, I'm going to click the T key to get the move controls back. I'm going to go ahead and move it, and let's move it, I don't want to move it down. Let's go ahead and move it where it's slightly in front of the first tree that I put down. And let's click render, F9 key. Okay, so you can see that it looks pretty nice. Let's continue and add a few more trees. To add an object to a scene, there is a hotkey, and that's the plus on your numeric keyboard. So I'm going to click plus and add another tree. And so I've got another one. I'll go ahead and add that to the scene. And I'm going to click plus one more time. Click tree. And I'm going to add another one. And we're going to move this one over in front of our rightmost building. Okay, I'm going to click F9 and do a render. And we see our trees in the render. Okay, let's shift gears then and talk about this ground plane. It's starting to be a pretty interesting looking scene. With the exception of the ground plane, this piece of grass that we have laid out here, it doesn't look very realistic. So if somehow we could get this grass texture to be smaller and more realistic, I think we would have a much better result. The other thing, before I do that, notice how the tree on the right is darker than the other 3 trees. Whenever you add an additional object to a scene in layout that you have some light sources set up on, make sure you have the light sources you want affecting those new models. For example, I'm going to click on the lights button in the bottom of the interface and click on the P key for light properties. And I'm going to click on my regular light, which is just called light, and click on objects. And notice the only thing that light does not affect is the sky dome. Okay. Now I'm going to click on the sky dome, and if you recall from a previous video, I did not want my skylight to affect anything except for the sky. So I'm also going to exclude these 4 trees that I added. Now back to the other light source. This is the light source that's affecting the trees, and right now it's a point light source. So one thing I could do here in order to get the rightmost tree to show up better is I could move this light source, and let's set this where it's a little bit better for you to see. Okay, so in the left I see my point light source, and I can just grab it and move it around, and we'll position it more in front of this entire scene, where it's going to affect not only the trees that were in back, but also that one tree that was in front. And to verify that's where I want it, I'm just going to click F9 and do a render. And so now I see that that light source is hitting all of the trees as well as the buildings. Okay. Now let's talk about the grass. All right. The texture for this grass is a pretty interesting texture. Let's go ahead and look at the model in Lightwave that we have for this. It's called ground. And as you recall, this is a pretty big rectangle as far as a 3D model is concerned. It's about 600 feet wide. And we have this one picture of this grass just stretched across the whole thing. So for that reason, when we do a render, we see it more like this. Alright, so let me show you a technique. In the bottom right viewport here in Lightwave, which is the UV texture viewport, I'm going to click the T key, and I'm going to click on the name of the texture map so we see the texture coordinates. And I'm going to zoom out, and I'm also going to use the pan tool to move this texture map into the upper left corner of the viewport. And you'll see why in a minute. Now in point selection mode, I'm going to select all the points. Okay. I'm going to hold down the shift key and hit H, or capital H. That turns on my scaling tool. And then in the top left corner of the UV map, I'm going to hold down my left mouse button, and notice what happens if I do this. If I start making the texture map smaller in relation to the texture. Basically, we zoom into the texture, and that's going to make my problem even worse. So I'm going to have these gigantic leaves in my scene. But we can do the other thing. We can zoom back out, and notice what happens. We start to get a tiling of the texture. So in other words, in this case, I don't just have one version of the texture, but I have many versions, and they're arranged in a tiling approach. So this is much more what I'm looking for, and I can definitely keep zooming out on that as much as I want. Now, the only problem with this, and it's not really a bad problem, but you can probably see that when we tile a texture across a surface of a model like this, you can start to see where it repeats. In other words, you can see the tiling. And I could even count these almost. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like a 7 by 7 tiling of this one particular texture. Now, I'm not saying it would be bad, but people are going to notice this in a render. I think it would be okay to go with it like this, but let me show you another technique. It's kind of a trick. And again, I'm going to use Photoshop because that's just the tool that I'm familiar with. And I believe you can do the same thing in GIMP once you learn how. I'm going to open this texture in Photoshop. Now, if you think about it, the reason that we see the tiling of the texture is because the edges of this texture, the 4 different edges, they don't match up. So this is not what we call a seamless texture. A seamless texture would be a texture that if you put 2 copies of it together, you wouldn't see a seam. So the idea is to blend different parts of this texture so that the seam goes away. And that way, if you put two copies side by side, you would not be able to tell that there was a seam between them. Photoshop has a really nice way to do this. You can go to the filter menu, click on other and offset, and essentially using these sliders I can offset where I'm drawing this texture and or this picture, and this will allow me to see the seam. So I've got it offset both in the horizontal and vertical dimension, and I can see where the seam is. Using the clone stamp tool, you hold down the Alt key, you can click on some area of the picture. So I'm going to click on this area here, and then I'm going to go to where the seam is. I'm going to start drawing. So what it does is it's going to pick up color from where I initially clicked, and it's going to put it down to where I'm drawing. And so I would essentially just do this sort of randomly. I would be picking up parts of the picture from different areas and then blending them over the seam so that the seam no longer shows up. It's not really of a kind of a science, it's more of an art form, definitely. But this is a very, very cool feature that you have in Photoshop. And again, I believe you can do the same thing in GIMP with a little practice. Now, I went ahead and created that earlier before the video, and this is what I ended up with. So this is a near seamless, it's not perfect, but it's a near seamless version of the same texture. And if you put a couple of these side by side, it looks pretty nice. And I saved this on a model I'm calling ground best. So this is the best version of my ground. And the only difference is it just uses a different texture. Okay, now I can still see the seams a little bit, but it's just not as bad as the other version. Now, you say, well, how do you change the texture in a model? Just go back to the surface editor where it says color, click on T, and then select a different image, whichever image you want to select. Click use texture, and then go ahead and save that model. Now, back in layout, let's go ahead and fix this. So this is the old version of the ground. At the bottom of the interface, I'm going to click on Objects, and I'm going to click on Ground, so I have the ground plane selected. And then with the Items tab selected at the top, in the bottom left of the interface, I'm going to click on Clear Selected. And it's going to ask me if I want to clear the ground from the scene, and I'm going to click Yes. Now I'm going to hit the plus sign to load a new model, and I'm going to load my updated version of the ground plane that uses the better texture. And so now you see I have that. Whenever you make changes to a scene, it's probably a good idea to save your scene. So don't forget that.